It was the size of an egg. It cost about $15. And its one real feature, the thing that made the whole world lose its mind, was that it could die. In 1997, this little plastic egg was the most wanted object on the planet. Schools banned it. Grown adults fought over it in toy aisles. Parents stood in line for hours, then paid triple to a scalper when the line ran out. The company that made it, Bandai, sold 40 million of them in barely a year and a half. And then, almost exactly 1 year after that, that same company was quietly burying millions of them in the ground. This is the story of a toy that was designed to die, and very nearly took its maker into the grave along with it. So keep that picture in your head. A landfill, somewhere on the edge of Tokyo Bay, filled with little plastic eggs. We're going to end up standing right on top of it. But to understand how the most beloved toy of a generation ended up buried like nuclear waste, we have to go back to a train platform and a simple, slightly morbid question. Welcome to the Throneyard. The question was this: what if you could keep a pet in your pocket? It came from a woman named Aki Maita, working with a designer named Akihiro Yokoi. The idea was almost childishly simple. A creature lives on a tiny screen. You feed it. You clean up after it. You play with it. You put it to sleep. And if you take good care of it, it grows. But here's the part that everyone forgets. The part that made it unforgettable. The catch. If you ignored it, it died. Not game over. Not try again. It died. The screen would show a tiny ghost drifting up, and in some versions, a little gravestone. Your pet was gone, and it was your fault, and you couldn't undo it. They called it the Tamagotchi, a blend of the Japanese word for egg and the English word watch. A pocket watch you were responsible for keeping alive. It hit Japanese shelves in late 1996, and at first, nobody quite knew what they were looking at. And then, schoolgirls in Tokyo found it, and the world tilted on its axis. Because here's what nostalgia does to this part of the story. If you were a kid in this era, you remember the sound. That thin, electronic beep that meant your creature needed you right now, this second, in the middle of math class. You remember clipping the egg to your backpack like a badge. You remember the little black and white blob, barely a few pixels across, and somehow caring about it more than almost anything you owned. You remember begging your mother to babysit it during a test, and the genuine grief, real grief, when you came home and the screen showed that little ghost. That was the genius. It wasn't a toy you played with. It was a toy that needed you. It made a child feel responsible, and powerful, and terrified, all at once. And the world had simply never seen anything like it. It got so big that scientists took notice. The creators were eventually handed an Ig Nobel Prize, the tongue-in-cheek award for research that makes you laugh, then makes you think, for the discovery that millions of people were happily spending real time and love raising a virtual pet. By the spring of 1997, the Tamagotchi wasn't a toy anymore. It was a phenomenon. And Bandai was about to find out that a phenomenon and a business are two very different animals. Remember the landfill. We're getting closer. When the Tamagotchi crossed the ocean and landed in America in May of 1997, the madness only got louder. Stores couldn't keep them on the shelves. A shipment would arrive in the morning and be gone by lunch. Newspapers ran stories about the shortage as if it were a natural disaster. Children wrote letters. Parents called toy stores like they were calling hospitals, asking, "Please, is there any way? Do you have any in the back?" And the scalpers. Oh, the scalpers. A toy that cost about $15 at the counter was changing hands for $60, $80, $100 and more to any parent desperate enough to make their kid stop crying. There were reports of the things being smuggled, hoarded, resold, like contraband. A pocket pet had become a black market commodity. For Bandai, this looked like the greatest moment in the company's history. Demand was, as far as anyone could measure, infinite. Every store wanted more. Every distributor wanted more. The orders kept pouring in faster than the factories could possibly fill them. So Bandai did the only thing that seemed sane. It built more. It cranked the factories. It poured money into production, racing to feed a hunger that looked like it would never, ever end. By the early months of 1998, the company had sold something like 40 million Tamagotchi, roughly 20 million in Japan, and roughly 20 million more across the rest of the world. 40 million little eggs. 40 million tiny digital lives, beeping in classrooms and bedrooms across the planet. It should have been the coronation. A small Japanese toy maker had conquered the world with a keychain. But here's the thing about a crown that arrives too fast. Nobody stops to ask whether the gold is real. And buried inside all those orders, inside that beautiful, infinite-looking demand, there was a lie. Not a lie anyone told on purpose. A lie hidden in the numbers themselves. And it was about to cost Bandai everything it had just earned. Here is the lie. The demand wasn't real. Or rather, not all of it was. Not nearly as much of it as Bandai believed. Think about what you do when something is impossible to get, and you absolutely have to have it. You don't put your name down at one store and wait patiently. You put your name down at every store you can find. You reserve one at the shop down the street, and another at the mall, and another through a friend. And you tell yourself you'll buy whichever one comes in first and cancel the rest. Or you'll just buy all of them and sell the extras. Now multiply that by millions of frantic kids and frantic parents, all hedging their bets across every shop in the country. To Bandai, sitting at the top, reading the order book, it looked like demand for 100 million toys. In reality, a huge share of those orders were the same customers, counted 3 and 4 times over. It was a hall of mirrors. Every reflection looked like another buyer. And Bandai, in good faith, built a toy for every reflection in the room. This is the quiet way empires die. Not with one dramatic mistake, but with a measurement that was wrong in a way nobody could see until it was far, far too late. Bandai wasn't reckless. It was responding, rationally, to the best information it had. The information was just a ghost. Fitting for a product whose signature image was a little ghost floating off a screen. And it got worse, because the company couldn't even see the warning signs inside its own walls. Bandai had grown so fast and was moving so frantically that the people designing the next wave of Tamagotchi and the people receiving the returns from stores were, in effect, not talking to each other. So even as the first cracks appeared, even as some shops started quietly sending product back, the factories were still busy building brand new models for a boom that was already over. The machine was running at full speed toward a wall it couldn't see. And in 1998, it hit. Fads don't fade. That's the myth. We tell ourselves these things cool off gently, that interest tapers, that the market lets you down easy. It doesn't. A craze doesn't have a sunset. It has a cliff. In 1998, the Tamagotchi craze went over the edge. All at once. The kids who had screamed for them 6 months earlier had simply moved on to the next toy, the next playground obsession, the next must-have thing. The desperation evaporated. And when desperation evaporates, all those duplicate reservations, all those phantom orders, vanish into thin air right along with it. But the toys were real. Bandai had built tens of millions of physical, plastic, fully manufactured eggs to feed a demand that no longer existed. And now those toys came home. Picture it from inside the company. The returns start as a trickle and become a flood. Boxes, then pallets, then whole shipments coming back from retailers who can't sell them and want their money back. The same warehouses that, a year earlier, couldn't hold stock for more than a day are now overflowing with millions of unsold eggs that the world has decided, overnight, it no longer wants. And the factories, because of that broken communication, are in some cases still making more. When the accountants finally added it all up, Bandai had lost around 6 billion yen on the disaster, somewhere in the neighborhood of $38 million. For a toy that had been the single greatest hit in the company's history, it was a staggering, humiliating reversal. The crown jewel had become a liability measured in the millions. And then there was the question nobody wants on a balance sheet. What do you do with the bodies? Because that's what they were now. Millions of unsold toys with no buyers, no shelf space, and no value. By some accounts, more than 2.5 million Tamagotchi had to simply be disposed of, destroyed, gotten rid of. And this is where the legend comes in, the image I asked you to hold on to at the very beginning. The story goes that a great mass of those unsold, unwanted eggs were taken out and buried in landfill, out on Odaiba, a man-made island sitting in Tokyo Bay. An island built out of the city's own discards, now holding millions of little digital pets in the ground. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because longtime visitors to the Throneyard have stood at a grave exactly like this one before, out in the New Mexico desert, where another empire once bulldozed millions of its own unsold creations into a pit and covered them with concrete. We told that story. Atari, and the cartridges, buried in the sand. Now, on the other side of the world, the most beloved toy of the decade got the same funeral. A toy whose entire reason for existing, whose one unforgettable feature, was that it could die, ended up buried by the millions in the ground. You could not write a darker punchline if you tried, but here's what makes this particular fall so cruel. The toy wasn't even the worst thing that happened to Bandai in this stretch. Because while the world was busy worshipping the egg, behind the curtain, the company's bid to become a true empire had already collapsed. And almost nobody outside Japan noticed. Rewind, just slightly, to the height of it all, early 1997, with the Tamagotchi about to conquer America. At that exact moment, Bandai was on the verge of something enormous. It had agreed, in principle, to merge with Sega. Yes, that Sega, the video game giant. Put them together, and you would have created a single entertainment colossus with billions of dollars in annual sales. A company that could have stood toe-to-toe with anyone in the world. The toy maker with the hottest product on Earth, joining forces with one of the biggest names in gaming. On paper, it was a coronation. In reality, it fell apart from the inside. The two companies came from completely different worlds. Sega was a hard-charging, somewhat freewheeling video game culture. Bandai was an old-line Japanese toy company with its own traditions, its own way of doing things, and its own deeply loyal staff. And when the details of the merger reached the people who actually ran Bandai day to day, the middle managers, the backbone of the company, they recoiled. By some accounts, roughly 4 out of every 5 of them were against it, worried about what the deal would do to their culture, their jobs, their identity. It was, in effect, a quiet revolt. And it worked. In late May of 1997, just one day before the agreement was supposed to be signed and sealed, the whole thing was called off. The merger of the decade, dead at the altar. The two companies pointed to a difference in corporate philosophy, the polite phrase for, "Our people would not accept it." and Bandai's president, who had personally staked his name and his reputation on making this deal happen, publicly took the blame for its failure. So sit with the timing. In the space of barely a year, Bandai went from this, the maker of the most wanted toy in the world, on the cusp of merging into a multi-billion-dollar empire, to this, a failed merger, a humiliated leadership, a record loss, warehouses full of dead inventory, and millions of its golden product going into the dirt. The crown was right there. The company had its hands on it, and it slipped through their fingers, not once, but twice in the same breath. So, how does an empire survive a year like that? The answer is the part of this story nobody expects. Because Bandai did not die. Bandai learned. The whole disaster carved something permanent into the company's memory. The lesson was brutal, but simple. Never again mistake a frenzy for the future. Never let the noise of a craze convince you the demand is real and the demand is forever. A spike is not an empire. And so when Bandai eventually brought the Tamagotchi back, years later, in the mid-2000s, it did the most counterintuitive thing imaginable. It brought it back quietly. No frenzy, no manufactured shortage, restrained marketing, careful production, modest expectations. The company had been so badly burned by infinite demand that the next time around, it deliberately refused to chase it. It treated its own golden child with caution, almost with suspicion, because it remembered what that child had cost the last time. And the strangest twist of all, it worked. The Tamagotchi lived again. It came back across the years in new shapes and new screens, in color, connected, reinvented for new generations of kids who weren't even born the first time around. The toy that died and was buried by the millions crawled back out of the grave, which means this is, in its own way, the rarest story we tell here. Most of the residents of the Throneyard never get up again. The Tamagotchi did. A pocket pet that was designed to die became one of the only things ever buried in this graveyard to claw its way back to life. But make no mistake about what got buried in 1998. The innocence of it died. The belief that demand that looks infinite actually is. The idea that a wave of frantic, duplicated, panic-buying desire is the same thing as a stable, lasting business. That died on Odaiba, under the landfill, with 2.5 million little plastic eggs. And if you ever want the whole rise and fall of the Tamagotchi compressed into a single image, here it is. A child in 1997, clutching a beeping egg, terrified that if they look away for one moment, their little pet will be gone forever. It turns out the company holding it should have been just as afraid, because they looked away. And 40 million little lives went into the ground. The Tamagotchi taught a generation of kids what it felt like to be responsible for something fragile, and what it felt like to lose it. It taught Bandai the same lesson, just with a few more zeros, and a landfill at the end of it. Every week, we lay another fallen giant to rest here in the Throneyard. If you want to know which empire we bury next, you know what to do. Subscribe, so you don't miss the funeral. And if there's a toppled titan you think deserves a headstone of its own, tell us down in the comments. Until then, mind your pets. They die when you stop paying attention. So do empires.